Hello, and welcome to this next section where we'll talk about running your code as a service. We'll start with a quick introduction into AWS Lambda and see why you should and shouldn't use it. We'll then take a deep dive into Lambda and see how to set it up and how to configure it. We'll cover deployment and getting your code into the cloud and how to automate it. And we'll finish with step functions, which allow you to create controlled workflows of your AWS Lambdas. So let's start the quick introduction and see why you should and shouldn't use AWS Lambda. Lambda lets you execute your code in the cloud, which means you don't have to worry about setting up or managing any servers or containers. This allows you to completely focus on your code. So why would you use Lambda? Well, first of all, it's perfect for processing events generated within your AWS cloud, things like S3 events, SNS notifications, or CloudWatch events. You can react to any event created within your infrastructure and even create your own events by triggering your Lambda on demand. It integrates with DynamoDB and Cognito streams, which means you can process data that is being input or changed in your Dynamo and Cognito. Lambda very easily integrates with API Gateway, which makes it an ideal backend for creating your APIs. The fact that Lambda integrates with many AWS services is not the only reason why you should use it. In Lambda, just like in many AWS services, you only pay for what you use. You're billed for the execution time your code actually took. Which means that if your code is not being executed, you're not paying anything for any servers that are standing by and waiting for events. One thing to note, you have to preset the amount of memory that you'd like your Lambda to be able to allocate. You will be billed for whatever amount you preset, independently of what your code actually uses. That is because AWS still has to allocate that memory for your Lambda and keep it ready in case your code actually needs it. You can very easily manage which AWS resources your Lambda can have access to by using the IAM role. This is very similar to EC2 instance role. Lambda also has support for VPC. It lets you execute your Lambda within specified subnets with defined security groups, which means it can access the resources within your VPC even if they're not accessible over the internet. For asynchronous calls, like S3 events, Lambda will also retry failed executions. And if you want, executions that failed even after the retries can be redirected into a dead letter SQS queue, which lets you process them in a different way or create a very simple alerting system. So let's take a look at reasons why you wouldn't use Lambda. Lambda has a maximum execution time of 5 minutes, so if you have a process that runs almost continuously or simply longer than 5 minutes and cannot be broken down, Lambda is not a best choice. If your code requires very quick access to a very big amount of storage, Lambda is not ideal. It only has 512 megabytes of temporary disk storage. Depending on how much data you're processing and how many concurrent executions you're requiring, Lambda may not also be the best choice. By default, you can only have 1000 concurrent executions. It sounds like a lot, but if you need to process many events at the same time, it may be easier to use ECS containers or simply EC2 instances. For request-response executions, that is, any synchronous executions, the payload that Lambda can receive and return can only be up to 6 megabytes. You can obviously read and write more data from sources like S3, but the content that Lambda receives with the execution and can return is limited to 6 megabytes. If your source code is very large, especially if you're writing Java applications, you have to make sure that it will fit in within the 50 megabytes of maximum code size. When uploading the code package into Lambda, the package cannot be more than 50 megabytes in size. This is usually not a problem for small applications written in Node or Python, but can become problematic with big Java applications.